In a previous video, I compared the shooting of Rayshard Brooks with that of another incident that occurred about 5 years ago. In this video, I mistakenly said 10 years ago, but actually it was closer to 5. The graininess of the video footage kind of makes it look a lot older. What I would like to do is do now a side-by-side comparison between the two shootings and see if, one, is it a fair comparison? And two, what are the questions we should ask ourselves when trying to compare two events? And if we do that, we might find some insights into what's going on in this country. Hello out there. I'm trying to get through.
With his powerful brainwaves cradled in the warmth of reasoning, it's time for Johnny Walker Dread to straighten you out on a thing or two. Emanating all the way from exciting Las Vegas, Oklahoma, it's the Johnny Walker Dread Show.
So the first thing we have to ask is, are the two situations comparable? In many ways they are. Number one, the victims were both unarmed, at least initially. Now, whether they would be considered unarmed after the fact kind of depends on the strict legal definition of that. I don't think it's necessary to even go into that. But initially, they are unarmed. Second, both of them go after the officer's taser. How do we examine the differences? Well, so we have to ask ourselves some questions. Number one, why were the cops there in the first place? If I'm going to compare two events, I think that's kind of important. How important? Probably not terribly important. Because as we know, cops can shoot people over events that started with nothing but jaywalking. And as we know, cops can take a person in peacefully even after he's committed a mass murder. So the initial reason for the call is not necessarily that pertinent, but I think it's still something that we need to ask. The next question we have to ask is, during the actual confrontation with the police, what crimes were committed? And this makes a difference because if a person commits a felony, what the police can do changes. That was Tennessee versus Garner. Another question I would have to ask is, what about the aggressiveness of the police? How did they approach the victims when they first arrived on the scene? The next question we have to ask is, what was the demeanor of the victims? What kind of role did they play in escalating the situation? We also have to ask, what type of imminent threat did they pose to the police officers? That makes a difference. Maybe that's the most important difference. And then finally, when we are comparing these two events, we need to ask ourselves, how do the acts compare? The shootings themselves, how do they differ? Is one more egregious than the other? We've seen the Rayshard Brooks videos multiple times, and I don't think that we really need to watch that again. I want to focus on the second one, and then we're going to draw comparisons here. This is a pretty horrific event. If you are squeamish about seeing this, I would suggest that you may want to skip ahead. You don't really see graphic detail in front of you, but what you do see is a very heart-wrenching scene, and some of you might not want to watch that. I certainly didn't enjoy it. I watched this video a few times, and I'm telling you, when I see it, I just feel terrible. But we're going to watch this anyway. Let's take a look.
Hey, don't even start. Stand over there in the car, and I'll be with you in a second.
Well, that's That's not what he would do for me. You got him doing more than I could get him to do.
What's the matter?
Guy comes in, he wants to drop the dog off. He's from Geneva. God knows not this guy. He can't drop the dog off.
Did I tell you to stand over there? You stand by the car where I tell you to, or you going to jail now. You can utilize it where I tell you to stand. Do you want to argue with me more? Turn around. Turn around. Turn around. Hold on, don't touch me. Don't touch me. Don't touch me.
Okay, the cop is going to touch him. I'm telling you right now, that cop is going to touch him in a big way. What was the incident? Well, this man went in and tried to give a dog away to the kennel. They demanded an ID from him. He refused to provide it. Why the police were called, I am not sure. The female cop there, I believe, is stationed at the kennel. That has to be about the easiest gig you can ever get as a police officer. She probably took on that job thinking like nothing is ever going to happen here. Well, she's dead wrong about that. So you can see already a couple of differences between this event and the one in Atlanta. First of all, we know why the police were called out to the Wendy's drive-thru. Rayshard Brooks had got drunk. Of that, there's no doubt. I mean, nobody looking at that video can say that he was sober. He was clearly drunk. He was passed out in the drive-thru. The police knocked on his window. He was very polite. I will say he was very polite to the officers. He's trying to keep from going to jail. Okay, so being polite, good move. That's about the only thing he did right that night. But he's telling the story. Nobody's buying it. They bring out a DUI officer. They do a sobriety test. He's clearly drunk. So right now we can answer the question about the nature of the call. Why were the police called? In one case, it's a DUI. In this case, it's a failure to present a state driver's license to a dog kennel. Okay. So we also see a difference here in the demeanor of the police. Say whatever you want about the cops that went out to the Wendy's drive-thru. They were very professional, polite throughout the entire evening. Now, you may argue after Rayshard tried to break free from him, things changed. Okay, we can talk about that. But up until that moment, they were really polite. At one point, the man said, that he was out there to visit his mother's funeral, and the other officer said, "Oh, that's terrible. Sorry to hear about that. How long ago did she pass away?" He's trying to be a nice guy, and I don't think anybody can fault the police for the way they acted up until the scuffle. So that's in stark contrast to here. This cop is really belligerent. He comes up, he tells the person to stand by the car, and this is a sovereign citizen, by the way, and a sovereign citizen is going to see how far he can push a police officer before all hell breaks loose. It didn't take long. He went around, stood at the back of the car. The police officer said, "I want you to go back." The man kind of argued with him, and that set this police officer off, and he's now going to go over there, grab a hold of the man, and push him up against the car. So you can see already two different, completely contrasting demeanors of the police in this.
Priscilla, come get this. Can you get this? Look at this. Look at this. I am a peaceful inhabitant. Stop. Get off me. Get off me. You want to turn around? No, I'm not. Get off. No. No. Yes, it's unlawful retainer. No. Stop. Stop. No. 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 Stop. 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 Let go. Stop. Stop. My children are called. You're hurting me. Stop. Ain't nothing happened. Ain't no crime been committed. You're unlawfully detaining me. Stop. Look at what you're doing to my children. Stop. Go. Stop. Get off. Get off of me. Stop. 37. Do not touch me. Come here, Mikey. Stop. Stop! Get out! Stop! Don't taser him! Don't taser him! Stop! Get off! He's tasering the goddamn car! Get it? No! Stop! Don't do it! Don't do it! Get in! Don't do it! Get in! Do not do it! Stop! 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 Take off! Stop! 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 Don't do it!
Okay, so we see another difference between the Rayshard Brooks shooting and this one. I looked pretty carefully. At no point did the victim in this particular incident try to attack the police officers. In fact, at one point, as he's walking behind the car, he had a clear shot of decking that female police officer, and he could have done it. She stood there like a store mannequin, stood straight up, didn't even take a defensive profile. He could have laid her out. Instead, what does he do? He walks right by her. I have not seen him taking a swing at anyone. He's just being resistant. He just doesn't want to go along, and he's a hollering a lot, but he is not attacking the officer. That stands in sharp contrast to what happened in Atlanta. In that case there, they were putting the cuffs on Rayshard Brooks, and he turned around and completely fought with the police officer, and there is no doubt about it that he landed a haymaker on one of the cops while they were scuffling with him. Much different than what we're seeing here. Okay, and it's about to get real now. Watch what happens.
Are you ready? Turn around. Turn around. Turn around. Turn around. Stop. Turn around. No, she stopped me right there.
Okay, so you saw what happened. The female police officer, who has done nothing throughout the entire time, had an opportunity to take him to the ground, didn't even try to stop him. And I ranted on her on the previous video. In my opinion, she really needs to be doing something besides anything with the public where somebody can become dangerous because she cannot handle herself. But at any rate, she has done nothing to help the other officer detain this person, and she's behind the other police officer, reaching around, trying to make herself look like she's busy. And according to her testimony, and I have no evidence to contradict it, so I'm going to assume, maybe unfairly, but I'm going to assume that what she is saying is the truth. This sovereign citizen tried to grab a hold of her taser. So what does she do? She pulls out her service revolver, sticks it in the man's stomach, and fires. Kills him. Right in front of his wife and kids. Now, I saw the incident at the Wendy's drive-thru. In my opinion, this event is far more gut-wrenching. Keep in mind, we want to ask ourselves that question about what was the nature of the crimes involved here, committed by the victims during the scuffle. In the case of Rayshard Brooks, he slugged an officer, stole a taser, and then pointed the taser at the officer. But I think that if we look at this objectively, we can see that Rayshard committed far more sins that night than this man did. So why didn't this event get any attention? I'm not even going to answer that question. You know why. If you want to discuss it, you could put it in the comment section down below. But I want to emphasize something here. The similarities between this event and the one at Atlanta are pretty strong. And I also want to review now the differences between these two events. In one case, you have a guy who simply did nothing more than refuse to give his driver's license. Why the police were even involved, I have no idea. There must have been something more to it. I'd have to read the background of it. But he doesn't seem to have been. He doesn't even seem to have committed a crime. Nothing more than an infraction. Could be resisting arrest at that point as well. But the nature of the event, the nature of the call is much less severe in the case of the Alabama shooting. Rayshard was much more polite initially than the man in Alabama. Of course, that changed drastically. Once the cops tried to put the cuffs on, it was no longer a matter of politeness. So what can we learn from this? What we can learn is that you have to be careful with these comparisons. You may think that, well, a white person would never have to endure something that this man did. You better be careful about making those kind of comments. And the reason why is we only have how many millions of police interactions per year? If you think that something doesn't happen, you can bet that it does. All you got to do is go to Florida, and it's probably happened there within the last week. So let's cut the crazy comparisons here. Rayshard Brooks was not shot because he was black. Nothing that happened that night indicated race at all. In fact, the police were really quite polite to him. Now, some people say, well, they could have let him go. They didn't have to arrest him. If he was white, they wouldn't have. But that's baloney. Police no longer allow people to just go home after they've been pulled over for DUI. And the reason why? Webcams. The very thing that the communities wanted is what's working against them now. You can't allow people to get away with DUI anymore. As soon as you turn the lights on, the cameras come on. And you're being recorded. And when you just can't walk up and say, well, I tell you what, even though you're drunk, I'm just going to let you go. What do you think's going to happen to that cop when he gets back to the precinct? It's not 1985. They expect the police to take people who have been driving under the influence to jail. That's what the people want. And if you're a police officer, you just can't do the wink and oh, that's okay, Mick. You can just drive on. We'll pretend this didn't happen. That doesn't happen anymore. So these cops, when they show up, and he's clearly under the influence, he's on video, they have to take action. They can't let him go. And then why should they? He broke the law. Clearly DUI. Why should they let him go? You say, well, to prevent him from getting shot. There's no way anybody could have predicted that. And besides, it was Rayshard that started it. He didn't have to put up a struggle. He didn't have to hit a cop. He didn't have to steal a taser. He didn't have to do any of those things. And he did. And now not only did he snuff his own life out, but he probably ruined the lives of 2 other people. So, as far as the sovereign citizen goes, well, he's dead. His wife and kids will never be the same. And I'll tell you this. The people burning down the Wendy's, blocking traffic, hurting people, ask yourself deep down, if they watch that video, do you think they would really even care?